A sense of mystery gathers around London's lost rivers, with their names whispered like forgotten deities from an ancient cult. Fleet, Tyburn, Walbrook, Effra, Westbourne, Neckinger. In most cases, they aren't so much lost as simply buried. Sometimes they break ground, appearing where you least expect them. Take the grey duct that carries the Westbourne above the District and Circle line at Sloane Square as an example. Yet the Walbrook seems truly lost. As Tom Bolton says, it is the most mysterious, elusive and comprehensively buried of London's lost rivers. While I was in London at the beginning of April, I decided to trace the route of the Walbrook using London's Lost Rivers, a walker's guide by Tom Bolton. Well, as best you can, considering the entire river is underground. Given the lore surrounding these lost rivers, I decided to share my expedition here as a form of folklore-meets-psychogeography. Let's see what we can learn both from the river and the history of the London that overlays its route in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This is the first episode in this month's theme, as you might imagine, because it is the beginning of May, and we are doing water folklore this month, which, as I explained in my last episode, I know I've done before, but there's just that much to cover, you can always find more of it. And I am doing something a little bit different from what I normally do, and as I said in the introduction, I decided to try and trace the route of the Walbrook when I was in London for the tarot exhibition at the Warburg Institute, because it seemed like a good idea at the time. It's one of the shorter ones, whereas if you were going to follow the Tyburn, you've got to start all the way up in Hampstead, and unfortunately the fatigue and muscle aches I get with long COVID weren't really going to let me do that. But the Walbrook is only just under 2 miles long, so it's much more doable, and I did it in a couple of instalments. And it was quite an interesting thing to do. But because I've talked about psychogeography on the podcast before, and because I've talked about London's lost rivers on the podcast before, and I've talked about things like the genius loci and all that kind of thing, I thought it'll be an interesting experiment, if nothing else. So we are going to follow the Walbrook. This is one of the rare occasions where I am going to say that there is more in the YouTube video. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you will see graphics on the screen because I did take photos to document the route so you can see what's there now. Where necessary, I've also included other illustrations that make points or support what it is that I'm saying. So it's a little bit more like the illustrated talks that I do. If you're just listening to this as the audio version, that's absolutely fine. I have put the link to the video version in the show notes just in case you'd rather see the images. But otherwise, as always, most of them will be on my blog as well. So I'll leave it up to you where you want to listen to this. But like I say, there is a little bit more visual stuff in the YouTube one. Otherwise, the audio is exactly the same for both. So you can decide which way you want to do this. But anyway, the Walbrook. What exactly is the Walbrook? Well, it's an interesting river in a lot of ways because the Romans actually chose to found London where the Walbrook met the Thames, and the river formed the eastern boundary of the first incarnation of Londinium, and the Romans also built a temple of Mithras beside the Walbrook, and we are going to come to that, don't worry. But I must admit, even by the 1st century CE, despite how important this river supposedly was, writers actually described the river as being choked with rubbish. And by 1463, the authorities actually built over the last open stretches because they were so choked with sewage. And it seems somewhat unforgivable that our waterways risk returning to such a state here in 2025, but I digress. So the name Walbrook could come from the aqueduct that carried the river through the Roman wall into Londinium. Others think it could come from Walbrook or Brook of the Foreigners /Britons/Welsh, according to Tom Bolton. I can't help thinking Roman efficiency probably wins the day here. Now, most writers cite Shoreditch as the source of the Walbrook, and in the Curtain Road area you do see various signs that indicate that a holy well was on the site at some stage. Now itself lost, the holy well did give its name to a medieval priory called somewhat unimaginatively Holywell Priory. Its grounds covered what is now Bateman's Row, Curtain Road, Holywell Lane and Shoreditch High Street. No one unfortunately knows where the well stood, and it disappeared from maps in the 18th century. So the best that you're going to get is New Inn Square, which is basically a dead end at the bottom of a decidedly unglamorous back street. And I must admit, when I first went along these two back streets, and I'm like, oh, this is where the route starts. Well, this isn't the most exciting place I've ever been in the world ever. But there we go. I must have looked a bit weird taking pictures in a back street, but it is London, so people never say anything. However, this area was far more famous at one point than it is now, because in 1576, James Burbage built the theatre for the Chamberlain's Men, which was William Shakespeare's company, among the Holywell Priory ruins, and excavations revealed its foundations in 2008. And it seems theatre builders actually chose Shoreditch because it fell just outside the City of London and therefore beyond the censorship of the City Fathers. In 1598 they dismantled the theatre and then rebuilt it in Southwark, and you might have heard of it because they called it the Globe. In those days Curtain Road marked the city's northern boundary, and it actually took its name from the Curtain Theatre in the area having been previously called Holywell Street. Finsbury Fields lay beyond, stretching to Moorfields, which became a plague pit in 1665. Now Curtain Road also heads south towards Liverpool Street Station, taking us away from the Walbrook's apparent source. Where it then crosses Worship Street and becomes Uphold Street, it's worth actually having a look west along Worship Street, because you'll see a row of buildings designed by Philip Webb, the arts and crafts architect, and you might not know his name, but you'll definitely know the name of one of his friends, William Morris. Now this row is 91 to 101 Worship Street, and it is a Grade 2 star listed building. Built in 1862, they were originally workshops and homes for artisans, with the idea that craftspeople could live above their workshops, and it's likely that the block only got the Grade 2 star listing because of Webb's status. They're not exactly outstanding examples of architecture at first glance, because they do lack the kind of ornamentation you would get with Gothic revival from the same period, but they are important because the intention for the buildings to house artisans and provide workshop space is true to arts and crafts principles. If you're not familiar with the arts and crafts movement, it did arise in part in response to the Industrial Revolution and sought to return the human to the manufacturing process, so items were often imperfect, precisely to prove the involvement of human hands, and it also explains why the buildings were apparently slightly unfinished inside. I've got a real affection for arts and crafts design and manufacture and things like that because of the fact that they were more expensive because they were handmade, and I think that we have seen a certain renaissance of those kind of principles in the wake of AI. So I do think we will have another arts and crafts movement at some point in the very near future, if we're not already at the beginning of one now. The buildings themselves don't really have anything to do with the Walbrook. It was just, this is one of the advantages of following the route in the book. I would never have known they were there if I hadn't been in the area to try and trace this river. So it definitely was quite good from that point of view. Now, the next stage of the route is quite frankly rather dull, because Uphold Street is lined with the type of buildings that you get in the city, which have all the depth and personality of a puddle. So I actually took a detour from the route, and this was kind of by accident because I wasn't really reading the instructions properly, and I wandered off into Exchange Square, which is a wonderful green oasis at the back of Liverpool Street Station. The station announcements take on a really peculiar quality as they echo around the square, but families played in the fountains and dog walkers enjoyed the patch of sunshine. I quite liked it because it meant I could actually have a sit down, and I found tons of forget-me-nots, and I love forget-me-nots. In terms of the station announcements, and this was a bit weird, if you've seen the trailer for 28 Years Later, and there's the odd kind of voiceover on it and it gets really quite over enthusiastic towards the end of the trailer, that was what the announcement started to sound like. It was very, very bizarre. But in this particular square, you will also find the Broadgate Venus. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, it will seem that I'm quite the fan of goddesses like Juno or Minerva, and indeed I am. But I do also have a massive soft spot for Venus as well. So when I spotted this huge sculpture by Fernando Botero on Google Maps, I felt I had to go and pay a visit. Commissioned in 1989, Venus weighs 5 tons and she's made of bronze. I love the fact that Botero has given her the kind of voluptuous curves that you don't normally see celebrated in art, and I think given Venus's patronage of the arts, I think she'd probably approve. I eventually wandered back onto the actual route from the little bit of a deviation I'd taken to pass through the Broadgate Centre, which is the shopping mall to the west of Liverpool Street Station. This actually stands on the site of Broad Street Station, and then before that the site held the Bethlehem burying ground for the nearby Bethlehem Royal Hospital. We are going to come back to that. The burial ground opened in 1569, but again also served as a plague pit, and excavations in the area during the Crossrail project found 6 bodies per cubic metre under neighbouring Liverpool Street Station. Now obviously I was actually supposed to be following the Walbrook, and there is a reason why I came through this particular area, because the Walbrook ran beside Broad Street Station and is now believed to flow beneath Broadgate Circus. And I did pause to take some photos so you could see what it looks like, and I wondered how many of those enjoying lunch in the sun realised what once lay beneath their feet. My next stage took me down Blomfield Street, at which point one of my dearest friends had come to join me for this fabulous folklore adventure. And while Blomfield Street is now quite typical of the City of London, so it's basically too narrow with tall buildings that hem in any passerby, it marks the old site of the Moorfields. And this was an open fen-like area that people treated much the way that they treat parks in London now, essentially as somewhere to walk. Although at one point they did also use it for archery practice and hanging out washing, and I think those two last activities might raise a bit of an eyebrow now. The Moorfields also became a vast encampment for those made homeless by the Great Fire in 1666. It is worth noting at this point that landlords did empty latrines directly into the Walbrook here, so we can't only imagine how filthy the river was at this point on the route. It flowed onwards in its aqueduct through the Roman Wall at the point where Blomfield Street meets London Wall, and builders found remains of the aqueduct in 1840, apparently still covered in moss. Now, London Wall itself still looks pretty much like a wall with the way that they've done the buildings along there, but at one stage the site was home to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, which I mentioned earlier. And as much as I could talk about this deeply sad building for hours, it isn't our main focus, but it is worth a slight tangent because it was important to the area, and the boggy land, possibly caused by the Walbrook, is part of the reason that that particular building failed. And if you do want me to do an episode on the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, otherwise known as Bedlam, please do let me know. Because indeed Bedlam does come from the hospital's nickname, and obviously the word refers to things like confusion and uproar. And at one stage the hospital really did stand for everything wrong with asylums and mental health care in earlier centuries. Founded in 1247 as the Priory of the New Order of Our Lady of Bethlehem, round on Bishopsgate, its goal was to collect alms to support the Crusades. By collecting taxes to cover the care of the poor, it became a hospital, and then over time it gained its association with mental illness, although scholars aren't entirely sure when or how that happened. In 1676, the hospital had outgrown its existing site and moved to the London Wall site, famously a beautifully designed building, and obviously if you are watching on YouTube, this is on screen now. But before you get too impressed by the design, remember that statues representing melancholy and raving madness, and they are the names, I'm not calling them that for fun, that's what they're actually called, top the gates. So it's very much a reminder of what the building was actually for. Those in charge failed those in their care, using treatments that can only be described as barbaric. They charged the public admission to come and view the patients, perhaps better described as inmates, and they also basically had a situation where if you were in there as a patient, you had to hope that friends and family actually came to visit to bring you food, because that was essentially how they actually treated those they were supposed to be looking after. William Hogarth immortalised the sorry state of the hospital in a scene from A Rake's Progress in 1735. Some people actually argued that the spectacle acted as a cautionary tale, but really it was financial exploitation of the vulnerable. Now, the building, which had been built far too quickly on poor land, was a mass of constant leaks and buckling walls by the end of the 18th century, and the governors just couldn't cover the ongoing maintenance costs. In 1815, the building closed and the hospital moved to a site in Lambeth, which is now the Imperial War Museum, but well beyond the purview of what this particular episode is about. Now, once you actually get to London Wall, it's quite difficult to follow the exact route of the Walbrook, depending on which route you're actually trying to follow, because following the river exactly involves going down Throgmorton Avenue, which is a private road home to the Carpenter and Draper livery companies. Now, the Walbrook once made its presence known here, with the land too wet for buildings, although that didn't stop anyone from building a tower here in 1967. The tower was demolished in 2007, and excavations revealed the Walbrook channelled along a ditch in the avenue. This section yielded various archaeological finds, including animal bones, leather and kilns, revealing plenty of industrial activity in the area. Now, archaeologists also found items in other parts of the Walbrook, and a lot of metalwork came from the bed of its main stream. While one theory sees that as just accumulated rubbish that had been dumped in the river, Ralph Merrifield argued that Romans normally disposed of their rubbish in pits on their own premises, so it didn't make sense why they would then go and dump stuff in the river instead. Metalwork is rarely found in these pits on their premises, so why would they put it in the river instead? And when I mean metalwork, the finds are quite impressive because they include things like keys, knives, coins, rings, hairpins, spoons and tools. And there's no real reason for them to be disposed of as rubbish. But thankfully, because they ended up in the silt at the bottom of the river, that's essentially what protected them from erosion. Are they ritual deposits? That's unclear too, because the tradition of offering metalwork to the gods using water is an Iron Age one, although there's nothing to say that people in Roman Britain didn't continue the practice, and Merrifield suggests that they may have been used to replace the alternative material used in deposits, which was human skulls. Because excavations found human skulls in the Walbrook in the vicinity of Finsbury Circus, which is earlier on the route that I'm basically taking you down, and these skulls were missing their lower jaws and obviously the rest of the skeleton. The original theory saw them as young Roman men who'd been massacred during the Iceni sacking of London by Boudicca, and yes, I do have an episode on Boudicca as well. Carbon dating places the skulls in the Roman period, although skulls from the Neolithic, Bronze Age and Iron Age have also turned up. The Roman skulls were most likely defleshed before they were deposited, given the lack of lower jaws, and that actually raised questions about whether they could have been related to Boudicca's revolt, because it would take longer for the heads to decompose enough for the jawbones to fall away naturally than the Britons actually spent in London. It was unlikely anyone would have just left decomposing bodies beside a water source, and there's also little evidence of actual violence to the skulls, so the question remains about how they ended up in the river and why. Now, my friend and I didn't find any skulls, thankfully, apart from we did find the remains of a dead bird, but we did also get a little bit turned around in that section because of the network of narrow streets and some of them being closed off and some of them not being closed off. But suffice to say, the Walbrook does disappear beneath the Bank of England. That said, the street Lothbury that runs along the northern side of the bank is actually quite telling in and of itself, because it is possible that the name comes from Lode, meaning a channel leading to a stream. And you do have to pass St Margaret Lothbury, the church, on your route beside which the Walbrook once ran. Now at this point I got really distracted because I wanted to go and see St Mary Woolnoth on Lombard Street, which I did have a look at in the church names episode. So again, we deviated quite substantially from the route in Bolton's book. And we just skipped the whole section which involves going a little bit along Poultry, and instead we just cut straight down Walbrook, the street presumably named for the river, beside the mansion house. Now the river itself flows a little to the west and follows a parallel course to the street. Now the Temple of Mithra stands on Walbrook, which I did mention earlier, although it's perhaps more accurate to say that it stands beneath the street. Access via the Bloomberg building, you head downstairs to the basement where you'll find the ruins. Entry is surprisingly free, but I do have a whole episode about the temple, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much here, and you can check that out if you're interested. Still, it was quite good to revisit the temple, having seen the Mithraeum at Carraborough on Hadrian's Wall, which is far smaller. At the bottom of Walbrook is a public artwork inspired by the now lost river. Titled Forgotten Streams, artist Christina Iglesias took her inspiration from the Walbrook River. Water flows down sheets of bronze that are moulded to look like a riverbed, and it actually has 3 separate modes to mimic the flow levels of a tidal river, which is a pretty cool idea as well. Now, while the water doesn't come from the Walbrook and is actually recycled within the fountain, this is probably the closest we'll come to imagining a river in the city. After the excitement of the Mithraeum, the route wanders into the tangle of buildings on the other side of Cannon Street, and you will find the London Stone in a shopfront on Cannon Street, and I do have an exclusive article for Patreon supporters all about it, so you'll be able to read that if you support at the lowest level possible, which is something like 75p a month or something like that. It's about $1 a month anyway. The route first follows Cloak Lane and then College Hill, and together those two streets were originally known as Elbow Lane. And the Cutler's Hall on Cloak Lane belies the industry close to the Walbrook, and it was somewhere in this area in the late 19th century that someone found the head of a Roman statue in the river. Passing down College Hill takes you past St Michael Paternoster, and the original 13th century church on the site burned down in the Great Fire of London, and then Sir Christopher Wren oversaw the building of the church we see today. But it's notable for London history because in 1409 Dick Whittington himself paid for the rebuilding and extension of the church, and then he was buried there in 1423, although the tomb is now lost, and I do have a separate episode on Dick Whittington. Whittington also founded the College of St Spirit and St Mary at St Michael's, although most people just called it Whittington's College for short. And it did relocate to Highgate in the 1820s, but it also gave its name to College Hill here in the city. We then crossed Whittington Gardens to follow Upper Thames Street, which marks the original line of the Thames riverbank in Roman London. Across Upper Thames Street we headed down Cousin Lane, which runs down to the Thames, and a series of steps lead straight onto the foreshore, and obviously we couldn't really resist having a wander around given neither of us had actually been that close to the Thames before, and plenty of oyster shells and animal bones lay among the stones and broken bricks on the shore. I think we found loads of ribs. We found a lower jaw that looked quite bovine in nature, and we also found a sacrum as well, which again quite clearly came from an animal, not a person. So it was an interesting walk going along the foreshore because, like I say, neither of us had done that before. And it does give you a slightly different perspective on the Thames when you're like inches away from it rather than up on the bank. Now, the Walbrook actually discharges into the Thames further along under the Walbrook Wharf Walkway. That is not easy to say. And sadly, we didn't get to see it, which did seem a fitting end to an expedition to follow a lost river. So the river is still there. It's just the only place that you can actually see is where it discharges into the Thames. Now, for all it was strange to follow a river I never actually saw, it was still worth tracing the route. For one thing, it was nice to spend time with my friend, but following the Walbrook's course took me to streets I would never have otherwise followed and traced a path between important points in London's history. Given the Walbrook's importance to the Romans as a site of ritual deposits and industry, I really feel like the Walbrook isn't as well known as it possibly should be. Now, this wasn't strictly psychogeography because of the fact that I was following a prescribed route, but I do feel that the detour has certainly added a bonus random element which took it closer towards psychogeography. And the river thus connected sites that brought me closer to London lore, its Roman ritual past, and even darker periods of its history like Bedlam. I do highly recommend London's Lost Rivers, A Walker's Guide by Tom Bolton, which traces the routes of 7 other rivers besides the Walbrook, and I would recommend actually giving a walk a go to see what you actually see while you're on the route, because this is where it brings you into touch with parts of London that you might never otherwise have seen or even known about, like, for example, me finding these Philip Webb buildings on Worship Street. I wouldn't have known they were there had I not followed this particular walk. And indeed, who knows which parts of London's history you'll rub up against along the way. So I hope you enjoyed that little tour of the walk. Obviously, I haven't documented literally the entire route. It's more just the parts where we were rubbed up against something, be that obviously the Temple of Mithras, which I've covered before, and yes, we did go in again, or things like one of the sites of Bedlam, although the other site, you actually see a plaque further along Liverpool Street. There is actually a plaque to show where the Royal Bethlehem Hospital originally started. And I think it was just interesting to see these different sites and to think how the Walbrook's presence might have actually shaped that particular part of London as well. Obviously, I've got a fascination with London history and geography at the best of times, but I've also got a fascination with lost rivers. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed it. Next week, we are going to take a little bit of a deviation away from rivers, and we're going to have a look at some more wells, because obviously there's so many of them to have a look at. We have done wells before, but we're now going to do them again. But that's going to be an episode more in the usual style rather than this experimental approach. So if you have enjoyed this more experimental one with more images and whatnot in the YouTube video, please do let me know, and I'll see if I can figure out if that's actually doable to continue doing in future or not. So please do let me know what you've thought of this particular format. If you did appreciate the extra work that went into this episode, then you can always buy me a coffee. Although I think I've said before, it doesn't actually really pay for coffee. It does pay for research sources, which is still really helpful for keeping the podcast going. But anyway, I will see you next week when we have a look at wells, and I hope you have a marvellous week ahead. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.